The line has been crossed. If the United States has bombed Isfahan, then this is no longer a crisis being managed at the edges. This is a direct strike into the strategic heart of Iran, and that changes the entire logic of the confrontation. Not the optics, not the headlines, the logic. Because Isfahan is not some random patch of desert. It is not a disposable outpost. It is one of those places that carries weight on the military map and in the political imagination at the same time. And when American bombs hit a place like that, the message is bigger than the blast. It means Washington is no longer speaking in warnings. It is speaking in consequences. That is why this moment matters so much. A strike like this would tell you that the United States is trying to do more than punish. It is trying to reset deterrence. It is trying to break a pattern that has defined this entire standoff for years. Pressure on the periphery, retaliation in the shadows, escalation through proxies, and constant attempts to avoid a full direct collision. But Isfahan is not the periphery. Isfahan is the center. And the second the center becomes vulnerable, every assumption that held this confrontation together starts collapsing. That is the real story here. Because once Washington demonstrates that it can reach deep, hit hard, and choose a target with strategic meaning inside Iran itself, then the old buffer zones stop feeling like buffers. Distance stops feeling like protection. Geography stops feeling like safety. And for Tehran, that is not just a military problem, it is a psychological one. A strike on Isfahan would say something brutally simple. The battlefield is no longer where Iran wants it to be. That is a massive shift. For a long time, the entire regional contest has been built around controlled ambiguity. Militias here, missiles there, drones over one front, cyber pressure on another. A calibrated game of pressure designed to hurt, warn, and signal, without forcing the final, irreversible leap into open war. But a U.S. strike on Isfahan would move the confrontation out of that gray zone and into something far more dangerous. It would say that Washington has decided that indirect pressure is no longer enough. That some line, somewhere, was judged to have been crossed. And now, the answer is no longer symbolic. It is operational. And when the answer becomes operational, everything downstream changes. The first thing it changes is the credibility equation. Deterrence only works if the other side believes you will actually act. Not issue statements. Not hold meetings. Act. That is why a strike like this would carry such strategic force. It would not just damage a target, it would destroy a belief. Specifically, the belief that the United States will always stop short of hitting a major strategic location inside Iran itself. Once that belief is gone, the region enters a completely different phase. Because then the question is no longer, will Washington respond? The question becomes, how far is Washington prepared to go next? And that is exactly the kind of question that makes capitals across the Middle East start recalculating at speed. Israel would read a strike like this as a sign that the red lines are hardening. See, Gulf states would read it as both reassurance and warning. Reassurance that the United States is willing to act. Warning that the region may now be entering a far more volatile cycle. Iranian proxies across the map would read it as a signal that the conflict has entered a higher tier. And Tehran itself would face the most dangerous problem of all: how to respond without proving weakness, and how to respond without inviting something even worse. That is the trap. Because once Isfahan is hit, Iran cannot look at this as just another tactical event. It becomes a test of state credibility. If it absorbs the strike too quietly, it risks looking vulnerable at the exact moment it needs to project control. But if it lashes out too hard, it could trigger a second wave, then a third, and suddenly the spiral nobody wanted becomes the spiral nobody can stop. That is why this kind of strike is so explosive even beyond the physical damage. It compresses decision-making. It narrows political room. It forces choices under pressure. And the deeper reason Isfahan matters is not just location. It is symbolism combined with strategic utility. When a place matters both materially and psychologically, it becomes a perfect target for a message strike. Not just because of what it is, but because of what it represents. It says, we know where to hit if we want you to feel it. We know how to reach past your outer layers. We know how to make this personal to the state, not just painful to its network. That is why this would feel different from the moment it happens. This would not look like routine retaliation. It would look like a doctrine shift. And doctrine shifts are what nations fear most, because they are harder to contain than individual attacks. A missile strike can be answered. A doctrine shift has to be rethought. If Washington chose Isfahan, then the likely objective would not be random punishment. It would be to force a strategic pause inside Tehran, to make Iranian planners ask whether the escalation model they have been using still works, to signal that the cost of continued pressure has now moved from the outer ring to the core. In plain language, it would be an attempt to shatter the idea that Iran can keep raising the temperature while keeping its own central infrastructure insulated from direct American force. That is why the title says the strike changes everything. Because it does. It changes the ladder of escalation. Before this, the ladder still had space. Warnings, intercepts, proxy exchanges, limited reprisals, precision retaliation without hitting the core. But once Isfahan is on that ladder, the next rungs become much darker. Missile salvos, energy infrastructure attacks, maritime disruption, multi-front proxy retaliation, air defense activation across several states, emergency military deployments. Markets are reacting not just to headlines, but to the real fear that the Gulf itself could become part of the battlefield. And if that happens, this stops being a bilateral clash. It becomes a regional stress test. The Strait of Hormuz immediately becomes more important. U.S. bases across the region become more exposed. Shipping lanes become more sensitive. Insurance costs spike. Oil reacts. Civil aviation reroutes. Intelligence services go into overdrive. Cyber networks harden. Every player starts thinking not just about tonight, but about the next 7 days. Because in crises like this, the danger is rarely the first strike by itself. The danger is what the first strike unlocks. And that is where the military logic gets even more serious. A strike on Isfahan would suggest that Washington wanted a target meaningful enough to be felt, but controlled enough to avoid looking like the opening blow of total war. That balance matters. It tells you the United States may be trying to send the strongest possible message short of a regime-wide campaign. In other words, not "we are invading," but "we are willing to impose direct costs at the center if pushed." That is a different kind of threat. And for Iran, it creates a brutal strategic dilemma. ED option 1 is immediate retaliation. Fast, visible, forceful, missiles, drones, or proxy action designed to prove that Iran still has escalation capacity and still dictates pain. But that option carries obvious danger. The more visible and direct the response, the easier it becomes for Washington to justify a broader follow-up. Option 2 is indirect retaliation. Slower, harder to trace in real time. Pressure through allied armed groups, cyber disruption, maritime harassment, or attacks on vulnerable military footprints in the region. That preserves some deniability, but it also risks looking insufficient after a strike of this magnitude. Option 3 is delayed retaliation. Wait. Absorb. Rebuild the narrative. Hit later, somewhere unexpected. That may be the smartest military option, but politically it is dangerous, because delayed responses can be read domestically and regionally as hesitation. And then there is the most consequential possibility of all, that Tehran answers not only with force, but with acceleration. Acceleration in posture. Acceleration in weapons development. Acceleration in strategic defiance. Because when a state feels directly exposed, it often does not become more compliant. It becomes more determined to build the means to make the next strike costlier. That is the hidden danger in moments like this. They can restore deterrence in the short term while destroying stability in the long term. And this is exactly why one strike can change the map without changing a single border. Military planners understand something the public often only sees later. Wars are not defined only by destruction. They are defined by precedent, or by what is now thinkable, by what has been normalized, by what leaders on all sides now believe is available to them. If the United States bombs Isfahan, then one enormous taboo has been weakened. And once a taboo is weakened in a confrontation like this, the next move becomes easier to imagine. That is how limited wars widen. Not because one side wakes up and wants a total catastrophe, but because each move creates a new normal, and each new normal makes the next step feel less impossible than the one before it. That is why the world would be watching not just the strike, but the silence after it, the hours after it, the posture changes after it, fighter movements, air defense alerts, naval repositioning, proxy messaging, diplomatic signals, emergency calls between capitals. Those are the clues that tell you whether this was meant to close a chapter or open one. And here is the hardest truth of all. A strike like this may be intended to prevent a larger war. That is often the logic behind decisive action. Hit hard now so you do not have to hit harder later. Shock the other side into restraint. Rebuild fear. Re-establish limits. But history is full of operations launched in the name of restoring deterrence that ended up accelerating the very escalation they were designed to stop. That is why this moment feels so dangerous. Because both things can be true at once. It can be a calculated act of control and the beginning of something much bigger. It can be a demonstration of strength and a sign that the region is entering its most unstable phase in years. It can be a message meant to end ambiguity and the spark that blows ambiguity apart. And that is exactly why Isfahan matters so much more than the target list alone would suggest. This is not just about what was hit. It is about what the strike says about American intent, Iranian vulnerability, and the future of deterrence in the Middle East. If this happened, then Washington is signaling that the old rules were no longer acceptable. That proxy pressure, strategic ambiguity, and calibrated harassment had reached a point where only a direct, unforgettable message would do. And by choosing a place like Isfahan, that message becomes impossible to misunderstand. The center is no longer off limits. That is the turning point. Because once that reality settles in, nobody in the region gets to think the same way anymore. Not Tehran, not Washington, not Israel, not the Gulf, not the armed groups that have spent years operating in the space between war and not war. Everyone is suddenly looking at a narrower, harsher map. And when the map gets harsher, the future gets shorter. The next moves matter more. The margin for error gets thinner. The cost of misreading the other side becomes enormous. So yes, if the United States bombs Isfahan, the strike changes everything. It changes the meaning of deterrence. It changes the level of risk. It changes how power is being communicated. And above all, it changes what both sides now believe is possible. That is the real shockwave. Not just the explosion itself, but the collapse of the old assumptions that kept this confrontation contained. Now the world waits to see whether this was the blow that restored fear, or the blow that opened the gate. If you want the deeper military picture as this story develops, stay with the channel, subscribe, and turn on notifications. Because from this point forward, every move matters.